It's my pleasure to introduce Caroline Woolard. Caroline's an artist and organizer whose interdisciplinary work facilitates social imagination at the intersection of art, urbanism, and political economy, speculative design, critical design, and really blurs the boundaries, I think, between art and organizing. From 2008 to 2014, she co-founded and co-directed the resource-sharing networks OurGoods.org and TradeSchool.coop. If you are looking for help with something or have something to trade, those are both great places to start. I suppose you're going to talk about them and show them a little bit? Okay. They're still going strong, and yeah, I encourage you to check them out. Currently, Caroline's focused on her work with BFA, MFA, PhD.com, which raises awareness on the impact of rent and debt on culture, and on her work with NYC Real Estate Investment Cooperative, which creates and supports affordable commercial space for cultural resilience and economic justice in New York City. She's recently been included in group shows such as Crossing Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Museum, the Maker Biennial at the Museum of Art and Design here in New York, and Artist as Social Agent at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Her work has been supported by MoMA, where she did this amazing experimental project called the, what cafe? Exchange Cafe, which I saw and which was amazing. I didn't participate, but witnessed it. The Rockefeller Cultural Innovation Fund, I-Beam, the McDowell Colony, among many others. Over the next 3 years, Caroline's work will be featured in Art 21's New York Close-Up documentary series. She's currently an artist in residence at the Queens Museum of Art, and she was just named the 2015 Arts and Social Justice Fellow at the Judson Church. Caroline received a BFA from Cooper Union in 2006. She teaches at the New School, and I'm very pleased to say she also teaches with us here at SVA as of this semester. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Woolard.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much for having me. So I like to start talks by reminding us and reminding myself that often the works that we see in lecture halls feel more real to us than the works that we encounter in museums or galleries or public spaces. So the stories that I tell you tonight might become myths and folklore that circulate among this population and between friends. And in many ways, these work stories, what Magnus Bartos describes as works of art that are often mediated as stories, constructed, shaped, and maintained in a system of talking, staging, performing, disseminating, and circulating. That the stories I tell you might become more real than anything you see is something that you should be acutely critical of and conscious of in other lectures, not just this one. So rather than go on with a typical artist talk, I want to take a vote to understand what you actually are interested in, and I'll try and alter the talk based on the consensus, or at least the majority interest. So I'll describe each one, and then you can only vote on one. You can leave your hand down if you don't care. The first thing that I could focus on or emphasize throughout the talk tonight would be collaboration, the struggles with authorship, seeing as I'm presenting as a solitary person, but I often work in collaboration with other people. The next thing you could choose to have me focus on is the relationship between gift, money, and barter, the economies that I navigate, and I can be more transparent about how much I'm paid and a lot of the difficulties of coming to equitable agreements. And the last thing I could choose to focus on, if you tell me to, are the techniques, the crafts and practices of material poetry or humility that make these projects possible. And if you don't care, that's fine, you can leave your hand down. So now I'm just going to go through these three, and you can raise your hand once for the one that you are interested in hearing about, and we'll see if there's some kind of consensus or majority. So if you'd like me to focus on authorship or collaboration, raise your hand and keep it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. Economies, raise your hand and keep it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, that's like 35, let's say. And technique and craft, raise your hand and keep it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I see some cheaters. Okay, you just barely outdid authorship, but not economies, I'm sorry. So I'll keep this in mind. I also do this because it's, in a way, a portrait of this group. So it tells me a little bit about what your concerns are as opposed to other places that I talk in. So we'll focus mostly on economies, and I'll quickly explain 5 projects that are discrete objects that I've made, and then I'll talk about why I think it's important to claim labor for ourselves as artists and potentially activists. And I'll show you a project where I tried to look at what payment might be in an arts institution, and then briefly, but maybe for a little longer now that I know you're interested in economies, go through the infrastructures that I believe help us move toward a commons. And if we have time, we'll talk about the supply chain pedagogy that I'm developing and teaching here. And I will time myself so that it's only 45 minutes. No, I don't like that. I like discussions. We'll have more time for discussion. Okay, so 5 projects. I was thinking about this project that I did in 2008 because I wanted to remind myself and also all of you that I'm not only interested in making infrastructure or solidarity art economies, as I like to call it. I'm also very excited by the material poetry that is found in historic movements like the communitarians that you might know of from the 18th century. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Shakers. Okay, so if you haven't heard of the Shakers, it was a sect of shaking Quakers, people who are interested in a kind of ecstatic dance. And Mother Ann Lee is said to be one of the first female founders of this religious sect when it came to the States. And they were feminists with this female leader. You also had to live in sex-segregated housing, which meant, in fact, that there were many queer and gay youth who fled to Shaker communities, and this is often a history that is not explored or made visible. So I was at the MacDowell Colony, and I wanted to create a residence that had similar values, being away from the world and allowing people to take time to themselves. If you've never heard of the MacDowell Colony, it's a place that truly believes that artists should be outside of society and should have houses 1 mile away from one another, where they actually bring you your lunch to your doorstep so that you will not be disturbed. And for me, this vision of artistic genius as the kind of moment of epiphany that happens alone in an attic for someone who is not inspired by the world is slightly ridiculous. So I wanted to make a space that I would roll around to other people's houses when they thought that they were alone in the woods and ask them to have a confrontation with me as this unusual figure. So I made this space that takes the vernacular aesthetic of the Shakers and put casters on it, made a ladder back chair and climbed it and rolled it around to have conversations with people at this residency. I've also made very design-like interventions, just a simple attachment to police barricades that, when tipped over, make it possible for this object, which is so commonly associated with enclosure and police brutality, to be understood hopefully as an object of rest or dreaming, or potentially community safety. And this is an open access toolkit that I used with found materials. You can find it online if you're interested in making one yourself. It's just plumbing straps, a 2x6, some tennis balls, and a dowel. And I also wanted to share this project that's in development, which we're calling New Economic Policy. It's a project that I'm working on with Lika Volkova, which looks at the excess of materials in art schools, not as waste, but as potential power for a new factory. So Lika Volkova is making these motorcycle jackets out of the paintings which no longer have authors, the disclaimed works that you all do not want to be in relationship to, that you put in dumpsters or under your bed or in a closet or in a storage unit, and that eventually find themselves on the street and potentially repurposed by us in this factory where you could work and make jackets. In relationship to that, we want to create patterns that are also furniture. So this flat mat on the floor would be in the factory, and if you double it, the foam becomes a piece of furniture. And this is a pattern for the dress that you see on the right. It might be hard to understand if you aren't used to sewing, but it comes around and can create a dress. So Lika's idea is that many people today think that they would be better served to continuously dream of a better future where they will make a lot of money in the arts, or where they will make a lot of money anywhere else, all the while working in the service industry for less than $15 an hour. Or working in a cafe, dreaming of this better future, filling out all of these applications, whether it's for a job or residency or another career. We find ourselves often in cafes where we are either spending $15 an hour or being paid $15 an hour. And her very contentious proposal, that I sometimes support and sometimes don't, and we can debate in the Q&A, is that if a factory existed for artists who were paid $15 an hour, many people would see it as an alternative community, a space to both make an income, a livelihood, and discuss the arts. I also wanted to show this discrete object before I get into the infrastructure that Mark mentioned, which is a timetable for someone named Hiram Maristani, who you may know. He's a very well-known photographer and was the official photographer for the Young Lords. So when Hiram was young, he was told by a curator, and I won't say at what institution, but this curator said to him, "It must be very hard being a Puerto Rican artist since there's no Puerto Rican art history." And so he, with many other people, created El Museo del Barrio, which you may know now. So he was able to come together and show very quickly, creating a very powerful institution, that this is absolutely not the case. And he also has been part of sweat equity housing projects all over East Harlem. And in conversation with him for a show called Anchor, I was able to learn a lot about the work that he did and to start thinking about a space for gathering to connect that work that he did when he was much younger with the work that many young people are doing today for community land trusts. And one last project is to show another discrete object. I've been thinking about the history of the @ symbol and how the @ symbol that you see on your phone and your computer refers to the word amphora. And an amphora is an ancient vessel often used for transport, for oil, fish sauce, grains. And it's called amphora, which means carried on both sides. It has 2 handles. And because the amphora was used as a transportation vessel, it eventually became a standard unit of measurement in the Roman Empire. And from there, merchants wrote amphora with an at symbol that had a flourish around the A, and this was used then by accountants to mean at the price of. So I'm interested in how this object became a standard measurement, and then a preposition, and then this ubiquitous symbol. So I've begun to work with glass blowers to make these ancient shapes, as well as the shards that you often see in many places, especially around Rome. And I'm starting to think about how you can understand such an old shape in relationship to the symbol today. And this will eventually be related to a project where I make a clock that ticks for 99 years. And I just wanted to show you my research images so that you know what I'm working on today, this morning. So the question that haunts me or drives me is whether you believe that art is a practice of everyday life or that art represents life. What are the politics of production? So it doesn't matter to me whether you believe that, as Picasso said, art is a lie that tells the truth, or whether you think art is something that changes the world in order to allow itself to exist. What matters to me is who you're in dialogue with and how you understand yourself to be able to make meaning. So another way of saying this is, what economies do I reproduce in order to make art? Who is allowed to be an artist? Who is allowed to be in dialogue with me? And the collective that I'm part of, called BFA, MFA, PhD, has started to answer some of this, looking at the American Community Survey and showing that, for example, although there are 2 million arts graduates in this country, and this is with a BFA, not an MFA, there are 1.2 million working artists, and these two populations don't overlap that much. So only 10% of arts graduates with a BFA, again, make their primary earnings as working artists. And this term is a little bit confusing. We should probably say earning artists rather than working artists, because we define working artists by people who make their primary income from the arts. So for example, I would not be in the 10% because I make my primary earnings through teaching art, and that is not in this overlap. And so we wondered, what do art school graduates actually do? It turns out that most people with BFAs are either working as managers, accountants, chief executives, architects, TV announcers. This is what other professionals means. Or they're working as sales or office workers, or educators, which can be all the way from pre-K up to college level. And 14% of them are not in the labor force at all, which can mean either you are unemployed or you're independently wealthy. So we wondered, what about these earning artists, the people that we call working artists, artists who make their primary income from art? 40% of them have no bachelor's degree at all, which means they did not go to a 4-year school. And this struck us as completely unexpected. And so a lot of the work that we're doing as a group is to understand what it means that there's this lack of overlap. And these two populations potentially are speaking very different discourses, but have a lot of skills that they could offer one another. And we've made exhibitions and reports. Our goal is to communicate both with artists and policymakers. We've been able to get national attention for this report and speak with many elites about how they might change their programs in relationship to these findings. We've also shown that although the United States is 63% white, non-Hispanic, art school graduates are 81% white, non-Hispanic. And if you look at sex, although our country is 50-50, more or less, male-female, art school graduates are 60% female, but earning artists are 46% female. And a lot of our statistics have been reused by the Guerrilla Girls, and you may have seen them in other sites. So we came together as a collective to ask, what is a work of art in the age of $120,000 art degrees? What does it mean to claim your labor in those conditions? So let's try and understand what it might mean as artists in this room to claim our labor. One way to think about art is that it's a way to make meaning of the labor that we claim for ourselves. So we make meaning in public, in lecture halls, in exhibitions, in articles, in dialogue. And the labor that we claim for ourselves could be understood in this way. While anything may take the form of a commodity, only one action may generate the value found within it, the expenditure of human labor. There exists then both myriad commodities as well as a singular commodity, labor. Ultimately, commodities are bearers of value, and value is a social relationship, quintessentially and necessarily derivative of human sociality. So how do we claim that labor for ourselves? You probably know Ben Davis's work where he says, the dream of being an artist is the dream of making a living off the products of one's own mental or physical labor, while being fully able to control and identify with that labor. So what I'd like to claim is that if art is a way to make meaning of the labor that we claim for ourselves, we can make that meaning whether we are employed, unemployed, or non-employed. And I'll talk through what that means in a few instances. So before I go to that, I thought it'd be interesting to know if anyone here is self-employed, paying their bills each month by selling art. So if you are doing that, raise your hand. Okay, so this is a myth that is often perpetuated by faculty members and visiting artists, while in fact many artists would tell you, if asked, that notoriety and visibility do not equate with financial success. So I would say that as someone who has been unemployed and non-employed, we know that we have skills and knowledge to share. I would say that we can claim our labor, support dignified work not just for artists, and create solidarity art economies. So I'll talk quickly about some ways that I feel I've been able to do this with collaborators, and then go into an art project that tries to bring some of these principles together into MoMA.
Caroline?
Yeah? So rather than selling our labor for a wage to someone else who can extract whatever value they want from it, we are saying that this work that we do is ours and we're in control of it. We can decide whether we want to show up to work today or not. We can decide how much we want to sell our work for or to not sell it at all. And this is a way to be in control and relate to your labor that most workers do not have. So for example, if I decided not to show up every day to teach, I would no longer have a job. But if I decided to take a year off from my artwork or to organize my studio in a different way where I wasn't there, potentially it could still function. But what's confusing there, of course, is that artists do not always have a wage. In other countries they do, like Finland and Sweden and Denmark, but in the States at least, there's no stipend for being an artist. Yeah? So I think self-employed is an interesting way to talk about it because many artists could be seen as small businesses, but entrepreneurial is something that I will get into later in this talk, but I would say that we should resist the entrepreneurial discourse around creativity because there is an enormous debate around the value of culture, and when people say you're an entrepreneur, they tend to mean that you take a small risk or a large risk with the potential for future reward, financial reward. And I would imagine that many artists believe that the reason they make art is not only to take a small financial risk in order to have enormous financial reward, but is instead hopefully to make work that can speak some truth or represent a context that they feel should be seen, not only to potentially make money later. And many artists are utilized by policymakers and cities at this moment as entrepreneurial figures. You can think of Theaster Gates, many people. So I think as we go further into the talk, I'll respond to that more. So for the people who are interested in economies, this part is for you. I would skip it otherwise. So very quickly, the ways that I'm able to claim my labor for myself is to create situations with very low overhead through a lot of sweat equity and trust. So 7.5 years ago, a group of friends and I decided to stop living in random sheds and backyards and non-workable living situations and build out a studio space together. But we did it not to extract the highest possible rent from people in order to stop going to work, but instead to provide a relatively low rent to as many people as we could. So we built out the space, and Christine Wang and I became the co-managers of an LLC, and we've been able to run it ever since. It's not without lots of drama and the realization very quickly that we needed to pay ourselves a clear wage. We pay ourselves $25 an hour and take $300 off the common rent that we charge people. And this made it possible for us to hire other people when we no longer wanted to work. So if you don't make clear the rights and responsibilities of management, it will never be possible for you to get out of a management position. So you're both feared and revered if you have no clarity of structure. But after 1.5 years, Christine was mostly burnt out and ready to go to grad school in LA, and we had to come up with a system. So for people, the 35 of you that want to hear about economies, this is one way that I was able to practice as an artist, because my space was more or less free after I deducted $25 an hour and $300 a month. And it made an intellectual community and a kind of family as well. And that made me wonder why more artists didn't have these contexts of mutual aid in New York City. It seemed that since we were able to do this on a relatively small scale, it must be possible to do it on a larger scale. And for that, I thought we needed to make an online network. So I started testing this idea out by making a dress with a single page site that said, if you're interested in this dress, make me 3 offers and I'll trade with you if it seems like a feasible exchange. And I got many things like photography and access to laundry and all kinds of things. And so then I brought together Carl Tashin, a computer engineer, Jen Abrams, administrator and performer, and 2 graphic designers, Louise Ma and Rich Watts, to make this site. So it's been operating since 2008, and if you're interested in getting your work done without money, it's a very simple interface where you search for something, find it, start a conversation with an artist, and hopefully make an exchange. From there, I realized that it wouldn't only be necessary to trade one-on-one, but potentially I could trade 1 to 15 with students and a teacher. So we started a space in 2009 called Trade School, where you would bring things that your teacher asks for rather than money, like childcare, transportation, materials, and you would learn a skill or have a discussion around a reading in this space. We had everything from sailor's knots. This person is an expert sailor who teaches sailing and knot tying on the west side, to Baudrillard classes. And this infrastructure was built first by Rich Watts and then by Or Zubalski, and it now works in 30 cities internationally, allowing people to agree to bring something for their teacher in exchange for class, rather than going into debt. So this is one example of how resource sharing can be possible and can be facilitated with an online platform. But for me, by 2012 or 2013, it became very clear that the kinds of encounters that were being facilitated online only had the depth of a networked information era, which means that they were privileged. They were on the privileged side of the digital divide. They were for people who were moving around a lot, checking their email, checking their phone, able to find out when classes were, able to work with the exchange that way. And I really wanted to do a project that was based in New York City and had the longevity that I think is necessary to have a truly transformative space. So I trained someone else to run the central hub. At that point, we had something called Trade School Everywhere, as well as 30 chapters. So anyone could organize their local chapter, but also organize new chapters if they wanted to be in Trade School Everywhere. So I stepped out of that role, and now someone in Trade School Indianapolis is running the Trade School Everywhere meta group. And I started thinking, what are all of the groups on the ground that could be connected to one another? I found out about a group called Solidarity NYC, and they showed me that if all of these grassroots initiatives, not just a barter network, but also a time bank, not just a credit union, but also a community garden, could link together, something that's known as the solidarity economy movement, the workers movement, the social economy in many other places around the world, could be possible in New York City. And so there's a map if you're interested in all of these initiatives, and we made posters to help spread this idea. And this was right before Occupy Wall Street, so after that, the group imploded in many ways because it was hard to deal with this influx of energy, and many small groups have come out of it. So if you're interested later in the Q&A, I think one of the greatest lessons I learned from Solidarity NYC was trying to understand when it's important to equitably compensate someone with cash and when it's more important to think about what could be an equal exchange of time and how to involve the amount of effort or skill you've developed when you're making an exchange, or when simply to go by a principle of mutual aid and support one another without a sense of perfect equivalence. If you want to know more about the solidarity economy, this diagram that was made by Ethan Miller has been very helpful for me. And when I showed it to William Pauhaida, he decided to use it to create the drawing that he made for Creative Time recently. I don't know if you've seen it, but the idea of a solidarity art economy draws on this heavily. And for me, it was important to see that a barter network is not in competition with a time bank. They're part of an evolving ecology that hopes to be more equitable, democratic, and sustainable. And all of these practices are in relationship to one another. So now I'll show you the most recent initiative that I'm involved in, and this is all because you said you were interested in economies. And then we'll get back to discrete works of art. But for me, it's important to say that yes, if I'm an artist that wants to claim labor for myself, I need to find ways to make that possible, ways that care about equitable distribution and not just everything for as much profit as possible. So in relationship to that, I've been part of this group called the New York City Real Estate Investment Cooperative. I'm absolutely not the founder, and it is absolutely not for artists. It's for all New Yorkers, and we're very young. We don't even have bylaws yet. We will be voting on them on January 28th, and there are many work groups if you're interested in getting involved. So the question here is, What if permanently affordable space was available for culture, civic use, and cooperative business? And I thought I'd show you the presentation that we gave recently exactly as it is, because it uses a very different aesthetic to present itself. So how might we fuse investment in real estate with concern for local community? Think of us as a democratic investment mechanism for permanently affordable space. Picture the vacant storefront on your block. The shuttered windows, the paint on the glass. You probably have one near you. In the East Village, a local hardware store's rent just went up from $4,000 to $14,000 overnight, and the storefront is still empty. And yet at the same time, our city just made the largest investment in the development of worker-owned businesses of any city in the nation. One developer of worker-owned businesses, the Center for Family Life, never has enough space. This means that for Si Se Puede, a cleaning co-op, meeting space is chronically overbooked. So when you think of a vacant space, what it means for the city is that there's a lack of engagement. There's no activity at night or during the day, and there must be another way. So I'm just one of over 350 people who have decided that we can pool our money to invest in buildings and land for local, cultural, and cooperative uses. The way it works is that you give $10 and everyone has one vote. So if you make a larger investment, you don't get extra votes. That's very important. And at only 5 months old, we have over 350 members. We have $1.3 million in investment pledges, a grant from RSF Social Finance, 7 work groups meeting regularly, over 700 RSVPs for general meetings, and support from a number of groups in the city. There are many ways that we might use our money. We could become an incubator, providing technical assistance. We could become an investment co-op with equity or debt financing. We could become a community real estate investment trust, a loan fund, or a partnership. We've made a decision tree to try and figure out which financial mechanism, scenario, and strategy would be best. And the public building inventory work group has gone to many commercial, vacant, city-owned properties that are just wasting away but could be used. For example, there's the old cable plant right here. And there's also this building, which used to be the Department of Health for the City of New York. This building is particularly interesting for our group because Paula Siegel and Rafael Jose from the New York City Real Estate Investment Cooperative were key organizers in stopping the auction of this building. So this group realized that this building was city-owned and was vacant, and also that it was about to be sold to the highest bidder in an auction. And so after telling the council member, getting a local pastor involved, and many local residents, they were able to hand flyers out at a public auction so that when it was about to be sold, no one bid. And this means that now many people in the community are interested in seeing what this building could be, and definitely not allowing it to go to the highest bidder in the future. There's also buildings like this. And we continue to have many meetings to report back from work groups and learn about what this investment cooperative might become. So when you think of a vacant space near you, hopefully you can imagine other uses. And if you are interested, we do see ourselves as both a school and a place where we can connect organizers across sectors, but also something that's financially viable. And our next meeting is on January 28th at 6:30. So I thought I should show you that just so you know the other kinds of presentations I give, and hopefully reiterate why it's important as artists and designers and craftspeople to care about ownership structures. So I thought I would show you a very quick video where Ed Whitfield explains why he thinks people should care about ownership structures. And then I'll show you one project and we can do Q&A.
the question was new economy, green economy, solidarity economy, socialism, what do you call the work you're doing? And a lot of times it's important in order to get work done not to approach it from the standpoint of an existing label, but really talk to it about it in a way where it grows out of people's life experiences. So one of the stories I like to tell when I try to help people understand a different way of thinking about the economy is I like to take the old fish story that everybody's heard. Give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day. Teach them how to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. And I like to point out why that's a lie. Not only is it a lie, it's a kind of a mean-spirited lie. That it's part of the whole blame the victim story that we've heard so many times. Because in a country like the United States, where education is readily available, it's simply enough to say that if people had just learned how to fish, they wouldn't be poor. But think about what happens if you know how to fish and all the water holes are locked up. You don't have access to a fishing pole or a water hole, then your knowledge of how to fish will not even feed you one meal, let alone the rest of your life. And in a country like the United States, where education is readily available, but where access to fishing poles and water holes is not, then this story serves a certain kind of way of supporting the status quo and blaming the victim. And I like to talk to people about access to fishing poles and water holes being the wealth of a community. It's wrapped up in your access to these productive opportunities that allow you yourself to produce enough, not only to feed yourself, but also to make a profit for somebody else. And we know that any exploitative system is going to need you producing enough for some more than for yourself, because you got to live and eat. But if you're not also producing the extra, that's where the accumulation comes from. So we live in a society where there's a huge amount of accumulation and this growing discrepancy in wealth that we talked about that was so much a part of the Occupy movement's discussion, the lesson that it helped teach the nation, and which is that this concentration of wealth ends up being a concentration of power in such a way that for democracy to be meaningful, you have to have control over something that makes a difference to you. It's not enough that you can control what color your hair is going to be, and you can't control whether or not you're going to get a chance to eat. All right?
So it might seem like what he's talking about is more of a desperate need, a ability to eat or not every day. But I would say that, like Audre Lorde says, you might have read, poetry is not a luxury. The ability to express yourself and actually feel safe and whole every day as an artist is as desperate a need as the ability to eat or have a place to sleep. And so it's not the case actually in this country that just because you're taught how to draw, or even if you are taught how to draw, that you'll have a place to show that or a community in which to be in conversation. And so for those reasons, I think it's incredibly important to think about the institutions that are available to you, whether it's an art school or a gallery space or a public art fund, and what kinds of work they accept. And I would urge you to look into the histories of institutions around you, like El Museo del Barrio, which came from this place of complete violence and non-recognition. A curator saying to a very well-known artist, even at that time as a young person, it must be hard being an artist with no Puerto Rican art history. And while that video might seem like it's just about eating and basic sustenance, what I think as an artist is that for many of us, being in the arts is the only place where we feel safe. And we come here out of a kind of weirdness in our past that makes us hope that finally in art school we'll find a place where being weird, being different, sharing very vulnerable expressions from our past is not only accepted, but engaged with and acknowledged. And often, because of the structures of privilege that make accessing art school so difficult, art school is not a place where that happens. But I think if we can build alternative institutions and reform the ones that we are participating in, we can feel that it is a place where being taught to make art is also equivalent to being able to have a lifelong conversation about it. So I'll show you one last project. that tried to do some of this in a very elite art space, and then we can go into the Q&A. So I was approached by Pablo Helguera in 2011 to do a project with the education department at MoMA that tried to teach something about the collection. And it was my hope that it could happen on the free side of MoMA. If you don't know, if you enter near the Cullman Research Center, it's always free. So I wanted it to be a space that was convivial and also that embodied principles that I saw quite radically in artworks themselves, but often not in the spaces outside of the museum where many people congregate and have long conversations. So in Exchange Cafe, the idea was that the educators will be actively involved in the subjects they talk about. So this was a space dedicated to the solidarity art economy, and therefore the educators needed to be actively practicing outside of the museum in these initiatives. So the way it worked is you would have to give 3 pieces of currency, we called them resources, with your demands and desires. You'd sign them and then get 2 in exchange. So the cafe circulated people's interests and needs. And some people didn't take it very seriously. They just wrote something quickly. Maybe this was serious, but love and love. And other people very carefully wrote their contact information and things that they were looking for. So I'll talk about this project by showing when I think collaboration is both desirable and possible, understanding it as shared decision-making power, shared labor, and shared benefits. And I'm going to use this model from the ladder of citizen participation. You might know Sherry Arnstein's famous article. If you don't, it's something that has become very well known, and what she talks about is the relationship between informing residents when you're doing urban planning and fully empowering residents. So this bottom line is taken from her. And what you'll notice is as you begin to fully empower or collaborate with people, you move from a specific object or product toward a process, because you can't possibly know what you're making if you're fully collaborating with someone else who could change that thing. So for example, with the currency, this is definitely a simple object. People were informed that they could use the currency, and there was room for that object to change. But with the tea and coffee that we served, it came from the Feral Trade Network. This is a project by an artist named Kate Rich, who decided long ago not to travel and instead to use the existing travel routes of her friends to ship goods and to take the money that any art institution would have paid for airfare and hotel directly in her bank account, saying, I realize that most art institutions spend more money supporting travel, airfare and lodging than artists themselves. So she no longer travels. She takes that money directly, and she uses the existing travel routes to ship the Feral Trade Network goods. And it's feral as in willfully wild. So she does consult her, the people who use her network. If you want to use the Feral Trade Network, she ships many things. And she does alter the project based on those consultations, but you can't know exactly how. And the milk came from a group called Milk Not Jails. Their motto is, if the economy depends on us, let's drink milk and eat ice cream rather than building more prisons. And they're very well known around New York. If you're interested in prison abolition work, I'd say you should get in touch with them if you haven't already. Tychicus Baker and Lauren Melodia are core organizers, and they staffed the Exchange Cafe as educators. And they bring many people into Milk Not Jails, fully collaborating in order to create new initiatives together. They both do reform work and organize a dairy cooperative, so they distribute milk and connect urban youth to rural farmers to try and meet the demands of both constituencies, recognizing that farms are closing while prisons are opening, but often these two groups don't see themselves as potential allies. So the space had information about work in the collection, including this first work set from Franz Erhard Walther. And the principles of the cafe were displayed there with an online network that connected contemporary artists to artists in the collection. So this archive wants to be collaborative, but because I've been running it without much feedback, I'd say that it remains simply informing people about how they might participate. And for those of you that are interested in politically engaged work or social engaged art, if that's what you want to call it, I think it's important to have a theory of change, or to at least acknowledge that there are many theories of social change that artists tend to lean toward, but don't articulate in public lectures like this. So for example, you might believe that if you transform enough individuals, the world you want to see will be made. Or you might believe that if you establish reliable institutions that guarantee democracy, equity, justice, and fair allocation of resources, the world you want to see will be made. Or you might believe that you need to create a space for dialogue. This is something that I tend to rely on, for better or worse. Or you might think that if you work with key people who hold power, they might be able to share it. This is something that I uncomfortably acknowledge when I work in elite institutions, as many of the art institutions I encounter, like this one, do have key people who hold power and might share it. And another one that visual artists in schools tend not to be as motivated to participate in, but maybe you'll prove me wrong, is the theory of change that if enough people mobilize, leaders will follow. So at MoMA, I was able to change the exclusionary hiring practices they had. They used non-union catering contracts and weren't hiring people that had criminal records. So they changed that because many people in milk nut jails have a criminal record. I was able to bring in ongoing and lifelong practices, not just short-term projects like the Feral Trade Network, milk nut jails. And I created a space for solidarity economies and more intimate one-on-one exchange while continuing to work in and on collectively organized initiatives elsewhere. So the furniture I made wanted, again, to be collaborative, but very few people have modified the barricade to bed that I know of. And I thought I would just end with this question so that we can talk about what you think and how I may have communicated or miscommunicated my interest in the politics of production. Thank you.
I guess I just have like a few comments. I guess potentially I sort of found it problematic, the question of like who is allowed to be an artist, because I kind of feel like whether it's in like the fields of arts or something else, it's like if someone wants it that much, they'll find a way to do it, rather than it being like, I know that like potentially being an artist or even going to a school like SVA, though, you know, that it is at a sort of particular level. But I just sort of feel like if someone wants something enough, they'll find a way to kind of, be able to do that. And the other thing is I was also wondering about like the artist sort of addressing like the weirdness of our past, because I was also thinking of like the profession of like being a psychoanalyst potentially, and I think that sort of is like another way of like analysing the past, or maybe that's why people choose to go into that profession, because they want to like understand things of their past.
Sure. Okay, so those are two very different things. The first one, the reason I said who gets to be an artist is it's an antagonistic question, because I want people to think through what it means to be in this country when there's so few art classes in public schools, and therefore it's hard for many people to feel comfortable or even imagine the idea of going for a higher degree in the arts. And there are definitely much greater challenges for some people than for others. And it's exacerbated by the cost of art schools. So we know that 7 of the top 10 most expensive schools in the country, after scholarships and aid, are art schools. And so it means that the kinds of people that you have in conversation are either experiencing a kind of class war in the classroom where some people have enormous amounts of debt and others are, easily getting supported, or it means that they just don't go. And there's no imagination around the kinds of arts discourse that is perpetuated in spaces like this. So I think what's interesting about the difference between earning artists and arts graduates is that there are many earning artists, 40% of whom do not have a 4-year degree, who clearly are artists. It's just that the kinds of artists that are acknowledged in spaces like this often have as a prerequisite an arts degree in order to feel comfortable with the norms and roles and rules in these spaces.
Yeah, and I was sort of aware that it was like maybe specifically talking about like America, because I know like in, say, Amsterdam, it's like a different situation.
Completely, yeah. And in many of those spaces, they're looking forward toward this American model. So I'd say absolutely you're subsidized in many other countries as an artist, and the arts education is much more equitable, but it's being cut back drastically. So, and then in terms of, should art school be a place where we have a psychologized critique that looks at your past and your childhood, that's something that I think you could debate for a long time, but you can look at the rise of the psychologized critique in the 50s after the Cold War and abstract expressionism. There's a long history of treating a critique not as a place to correct someone's line and hone a craft, but instead as a space where an excess of speech and a charismatic figure who tends to psychologize students reigns supreme. If you're interested in that history, Howard Singerman wrote a book about it. So I'm not saying that that needs to be the space of art school, but it often is people's experience.
Thank you. Who was it? Howard, what was his surname? Sorry.
Singerman.
Singerman.
And it's called Art Subjects. There's also a book, if you're interested in these things, called The Program Era by Mark McGurl. And what he shows is that certain forms become normalized in school. So, for example, he's focusing mainly on creative writing. But what he shows is that you can't have a campus novel, a novel that would imagine a campus as a site that's normal, until you have creative writers going into MFA programs on such a scale that you have this whole genre of campus novels coming out. And I'd say that similarly in the visual arts, you can't have something like a performance lecture until you have enough artists going into lecture halls to think of it as a normal site. But anyway, I saw another question. Yeah?
Did you ever have you ever had to get loan for a project? Or another question is, what do you think of loaning money from the government?
Yes, I have a lot of loans at the moment. They're for projects and for many life needs that came up, but because I went to Cooper Union when it was tuition free and I never got a master's degree, I don't have any loans from that time. And that's why it's so important for us to fight for free and low-cost education. But absolutely, I know what it feels like to have to make your loan payments every month. I have huge payments right now.
A lot of your projects seem to, they needed people to work. So I guess my question is, how did you expand your network, and how did you find, the people to get involved with all these different projects?
Sure, yeah, let's look at a specific one. I think for me, many people won't believe this, but when we started the studio space, I just want to show you the people in it. Okay, so when we started this studio space, I literally had never asked anyone to show up for anything for me in my life. And everyone told us not to do it because we took out a big loan that we had to pay off. And I had never asked anyone to come to a meeting. I had never asked anyone to come to a party, even. I actually like hanging out one-on-one with most people. I had never thought I would ever give a lecture, nothing. So this was the beginning for me because I realized that if you take this kind of risk, but not in an entrepreneurial way for a future profit, but you're very transparent with people about your goals, they begin to trust you in a way, and you can build this community of respect where you know that you're doing it to try as best you can to make a space of some kind of equity. Now, clearly, some people come in there with way more resources than others. Some people are able to put in more time than others. But it was through that that I realized that if you just put the sweat equity out there and have a big vision, people are drawn to it. And this was a very private endeavor. We never really needed anybody to know about it. We just needed to fill the space, and friends brought in friends. So we also saw that good people attract good people, and it wasn't hard for us to get a lot of people there. And then for our goods, it was very slow. We wanted it to be international overnight. We had all these ideas because it was online. But in reality, for the first 3 years, it was mostly everyone I knew or Jen knew or Carl or Rich or Louise already knew. And it's grown much more slowly than we would like. So I think now we have maybe 7,000 people, but maybe 200 are active every month. So it's pretty small. And trade school, without any grant money, grew this fast. Over, I guess, in New York it grew, we did classes every single day for 2 months, and then we had to shut down because we didn't have a space anymore, and we kept opening and shutting down based on space problems, and we eventually closed in New York. But because it was much easier in that it was just a meeting, and it didn't matter, like in a one-to-one exchange, if one person doesn't show up, you have a huge problem. But in a class, if it's 15 to 1 and one person doesn't show up, it still works. So it's easier in this group exchange dynamic to feel a great sense of an alternative economy, that there's real mutual aid built between strangers. And I think because of that, it's opened in many places all around the world. And for that, it just took a lot of Skype conversations, making sure that people weren't using it to promote some company or product, and instead shared our principles. Yeah. Yeah?
And you think about people that work with you. On which terms you decide what each person does, how you regulate that?
It completely depends on the group, but it is always a tension. So I think, for example, with trade school and our goods, the initial group was based on shared principles and different skill sets. And that made it a lot easier because there was no question about whether the design was going to look the way it was or something else because there was only one designer. In other groups that I've been in more recently, like BFA, MFA, PhD, we do have that problem where many people have the same skill sets. So when it comes to what will the video look like, we have huge fights. And it can get very conservative, actually, the aesthetic, because there's this desire to meet many needs. And I guess the way we've worked that through is to say that we have very few collective projects, which tend to be things like the report. And then we have individual projects, which are in relationship to the collective. So we call those contributions. And as long as everyone accepts what you make, you put it up in relationship to the collective. But this is an ongoing challenge, absolutely.
And this thing with solidarity, the solidarity project, how it worked. There is many people.
Yeah, in that group, it's tons of people coming in, and it depends on the meeting, but at least 2 years ago, because I am not involved in that group anymore, after Occupy, many different factions started. And in that group, the way it did work was you would come to many meetings as a visitor until you would be brought into the collective, and someone would slowly teach you how it operates. But there weren't that many projects. There was just one project called the Deep Listening Project, where we interviewed many organizers and owners of cooperative businesses and solidarity initiatives. So there were very clear tasks, and they were actually relatively low skill. So you could do it in groups of 3, and then we hired filmmakers and designers outside of the collective. Yeah. Yeah?
So I have a question about maybe you can say something about the vibe of New York in regards to how the Occupy Wall Street kind of took off the group that you were involved with to a different direction than maybe you were hoping for, and also the way this New York project that is on the screen right now. I forgot about what is it. It's like, do you think that New York has a different vibe in terms of how the large group of people can function as the collective?
Well, I mean, New York as compared to other countries, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Canadians, for example, I was in an amazing meeting with a Canadian recently where he said, we would never build a real estate investment cooperative before we built a movement that's visible on the streets. He was like, we shut down our schools. He was like, we have built the credit unions for decades so that first you have a movement, then you have very powerful institutions, and then you have little initiatives like a real estate investment cooperative that is never about individual members, but is always about a larger movement. And so I think absolutely in New York it's very individuated, and a lot of that comes from the histories of economic violence and exclusion that shape this geography. And it is much more difficult than other countries that come to mind when I think of the solidarity economy. But that said, there are lots of people organizing together. I think what was hard in Occupy was not necessarily the structure itself. For Solidarity NYC, it was that we weren't ready to grow so quickly, and you have to be clear about the model if you're going to become federated, or how you will come to consensus at scale. And I think we're doing a little bit of a better job in the real estate investment cooperative, but who knows? We could still, you never know. 350 people, anything could happen.
I just wanted to piggyback off of that really quickly. You had brought up the video and the discussion of the cooperative, and there was also a date, but not a location.
Yes.
As to where we can go if we want to attend.
Sorry, I must have covered it, but it's at the church that is on 7th Street and 2nd Avenue. It's called, here, I'll go to it. It's called New Middle Collegiate Church, and it's at 6:30. So right now, the cooperative is closed for membership. The next time you can join is January 28th. So you need to either bring $10 or we have a hardship fund. And then you fill out an agreement about our principles that you read. You can also read it online. And on January 28th, we will be voting. So you should look on the website before to know who you could potentially elect to the board.
Also, you were discussing earlier about ownership of your work and your career and how you function within the dynamic that is art market or out of art market. And then you showed some pie charts that included people who didn't go to BFA and people who were functioning as artists as a greater number of individuals. And I don't know if this was everybody's experience, but it seems like there's this self-perpetuating belief that it is so hard, so you get out there and then when it becomes a little hard, you stop. And I think people who didn't go to BFA maybe never heard that. So they work within what they see through real world experience. And what I see you doing is something very similar to that in giving that advocacy for the arts and discussing the sides of it that maybe you don't get from school. But I didn't see, like, do you often have meetings where you discuss business as art? Like, what you can do within your community to put your art out there in the most practical means and not just metaphorically or philosophically?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So many of the people who are involved in Solidarity NYC and also Our Goods are doing exactly that. So selling their work in different community spaces. Also, a lot of people are not visual artists, so they're part of theater and dance collectives where there's a system. You know, the house takes a certain amount, you take a certain amount, you help build the space together. Yeah, I think for me, it's been very important that up until now, I've been interested in creating work that I did not want to sell, and so I found other ways to subsidize that practice. And I am more and more interested in worker cooperatives and ways that we can create a livelihood for ourselves rather than always going someplace else to work and only seeing each other in meetings where we organize. So I have less experience with that, but most people on our goods are doing exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
So you've kind of addressed this with your entire lecture, but I just wanted to hear more about, I saw a lot of models for artists to create spaces and niches for themselves in the economy and create alternative economies so they can make a livelihood and, you know, alternative ways that can work. I was wondering how you saw artists' role in the greater economy. Sort of also thinking about the cleaning co-op that you showed us, and just like in your experience, how an artist can affect the greater economy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and that is related to this moment that we're in where there's this idea that creativity can be packaged and sold to urban space. So you can see with Richard Florida from 2003 on, the creative class has been a term that tends to mean technologists and people who are making a living from creativity. And it tends to be in design fields more often than in the visual arts. But this is a term that many urban planners and policymakers have taken on in order to hopefully make corridors of growth. So make spaces for co-working and very precarious laborers who are constantly hoping for jobs.
And
so
we're told that, you know, it's right, there's always a push towards you're your own entrepreneur type of thing and that type of work.
So I think what's so dangerous about the way that the visual arts have been theorized is that there's this sense that art is not work. That the easiest way to define art is as the opposite of work. And you can even see, if you're interested in this, you can read Marina Vishmit's article where she describes the rise of capitalism and the birth of the artist as hand in hand, so that once you have a wage laborer, you have someone who is not waged, who is not working, the artist. And so this identity, at least in the way it's theorized, is incredibly problematic because as artists, if we're not workers, then we never need to be paid. And that's why in many countries they call artists the non-employed. Because until you're employed, you can't be unemployed, and you can't receive any benefits. So as this model of a non-employed, passionate person, we now give way for this kind of Richard Florida entrepreneur of the self identity, which is the constant hustler who works out of passion, who someday will strike it rich. And this kind of entrepreneur is something that I think visual artists need to be incredibly critical of, because this is not going to work for anyone, but especially for visual artists. And the model that Richard Florida is creating has not produced wealth for the majority of people in all of the cities that it's been packaged and branded for. So I think as artists, we have to be very careful. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we're more popular and populist as a subjectivity or a caricature than we've been in decades. You can think about what an artist figure might have been thought of during the Red Scare, or even in the West Village in the 60s and 70s. as compared to today, when artists like Theaster Gates are hand in hand with the mayor, and where we, even in this city, have artists in residence. The idea is that artists are not so antagonistic that they would speak truth to power in a way that would be dangerous, or not so subversive that we should actually watch out. Instead, they're people who are professionalized and who hopefully will do good, but more or less become PR agents for existing policies that we then make look good. So I think the double-edged sword is that for the first time in a while, we're listened to as, good citizens, but at the same time, it's not to, in my eyes at least, make radical change. So I think we can use the position in order to speak to the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, all kinds of people. But we have to stay true to real requests that are feasible and necessary, and not just accept whatever artist in residence position they want that will just glorify existing work.
No, thank you. And what, if any, thoughts you have about, you use the word solidarity, possible solidarity between like worker and artist, or whether that overlaps or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long history in this country of trying to put artists and workers together. Going back to the 1930s, you can look at when we actually had a Works Progress Administration and we actually had employment for artists. It was skilled employment, which is important to note. Some people have joked that if we had a WPA today, it would need to be to write essays rather than make murals, because many of us are de-skilled. But you can also look at the rebirth in the 60s of this consideration of artist and worker and a lot of the failures there. I'd say today there are groups like Working Artists for the Greater Economy, which might eventually turn toward a union model. For me, the most exciting thing we could see, which is not accepted by many people, is this model that you have in Sweden, in Denmark, in many social democracies, which I know we're far from, which is a visual artists union. So you simply make demands collectively, and you do not work unless the demands are met. And in many other places, this is a way to demand to always get a fee for your exhibition, because no one will show up otherwise. Doesn't work. Okay. So it's a romantic vision that I have of this. And I know at least in the actors union here, Actors Equity, it works a little bit better than for visual artists. So this is one hope that I have, but I think one of the major issues is that as long as we accept this idea that art is not work, it'll be very hard to identify with labor because we don't have a specific job. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually think about what kind of tasks artists would want to be paid a wage for and how that relates to organized labor.
I got the mic,
Yeah?
so I'm going to ask it. I'm not sure how to phrase it, but something in between your social practice or things that can social engage things, and also art making, which is kind of the same, but I don't know what's the other side. Maybe it's poetics, maybe it's your personal practice. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I felt most uncomfortable when the work that I'm doing that is political is understood as social practice or socially engaged art, because that work tends to circulate in art institutions that have very short-term memories. They like to have 1 month or 3 month exhibitions, and they tend to want an artist to save a community, which tends to be a very patronizing or colonial approach to working with other people. So if you say, I share the problem of the people I'm working with, it's very hard for it to be social practice. Try and find a project where the artist has the same problem as the people they're organizing with. And I think that points to this power imbalance. And that, combined with the short-term attention spans and grandiose kind of representation of projects that happens in social practice, makes it very difficult to think of a context where that could work. Now, of course, I still believe that we could have socially engaged and political art that has its own institutions, and that already exists. It's just that when you look at a lot of the works that are held up in Creative Time, A Blade of Grass, a lot of these places, they tend to be short-term and also with this power imbalance. So, yeah. I guess one way to explain it is someone said to me, would you want to be a artist in residence if the city had an artist in residence for affordable housing? And I said, that would be a PR move to say that we need artists' housing, which I don't believe, because artists need housing no more than any other person. We have ministers who need housing, we have teachers who need housing. Why would it be that artists in particular would be held up for housing? And what would it mean to be an artist in residence promoting that? So I think because our affordable housing in this country, and especially in the city, is not affordable, it doesn't work for most people for a median income, it would be an incredibly dangerous move, because it would be this proclamation that people with educational privilege are able to access it, and I think whatever artist is brought in, if they do bring one in, I would be very hesitant to accept whatever they say about equity and, you know, actually giving housing to people who need it. Yeah?